What if I told you there's water sitting in plain sight that holds tons of fish, but most anglers just kind of skip over it? Does that sound too good to be true? Yeah, it really kind of does. But here's the thing. That water actually exists, and it is criminally underrated by a majority of anglers. So you're going to want to stay tuned for today's episode where I'm going to walk you through how to fish the hidden spots that other anglers just flat out ignore.
This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, and I am your host, Spencer Durrant. I really hope, folks, that you're getting out on the water. I was out on the water last week with the whole VFC crew. It was me and Alex and Berkeley. We got out there, and man, that fishing was just incredible. It was one of those trips where it sort of feels like too good to be true. You go through the whole week and you don't want the week to end. And then when it does, it feels almost like you're waking up from a dream because the fishing was so good. We got really lucky. We got into a wonderful blue-winged olive hatch. There were some really good caddis hatches too later in the day. It was just a wonderful, wonderful way to start summer. So I hope you folks are getting out on the water as well, because I think this is one of the best times of the year. It's one of my favorites to get out there on the water, right? Because it's not too hot yet. We're not tired of the heat yet, at least up here in the northern part of the country. We're not too tired of the heat yet. And the hatches are really good. Even though the water's a little high, the fish are usually pretty willing to play. So if you haven't got out lately, turn the podcast on in the car. Okay, don't quit listening to Untangled. That would be unconscionable. I would never recommend that. But do get yourself out of your vehicle. We'll continue listening to the podcast in the vehicle and cruise off to some fishing spot. Trust me, you can thank me later. All right. You can send the thank you notes to Untangled, care of the Pony Express. They'll get to me eventually. Oh, well, we've got a wonderful little show lined up for you here today. Really excited, as always, just to sit down and chat with you about all these different topics. We're going to be talking about some of the basic knots that you really just need to know if you want to fly fish well, how to pick the right leader, fishing pocket water, which is what I alluded to in the hooks. You're going to want to stick around for that. Casting on small streams, how to pick wading boots, and then chest packs versus vests and slings. So there's quite a bit that we're going to be going over here today. You definitely don't want to miss any of it. And I have one announcement to make too, because you remember last week's episode, I mentioned right at the very end that we might be doing a little giveaway for podcast listeners. And I got permission from the Brain Trust, from Berkeley. He kind of runs the Brain Trust. Me and Alex just kind of, we're the yes men of this outfit. This will show me if Berkeley actually listened to the episode this week. But anyways, the three of us, we got together, we talked, and we want to do a giveaway for our 1,000th podcast subscriber. We've got about 1,000 now between Apple and Spotify. We're getting really close to hitting that 1,000 mark. So to get us over the hump, you need to go ahead and subscribe either on Spotify or Apple Podcasts to Untangled. Once you have subscribed, you're going to go, there's a link in the podcast description. I'll put it in here. And you're going to click on that link. It's going to take you to a fancy little landing page. You're going to enter your email address. And that's going to enter you to win a fly rod and reel from VFC. That's right. One of our fly flingers, a 9-foot 5-weight rod. I fish it personally. It is a good little rod. A lot better than the beginner rod that I started out with when I started fly fishing. It's a great little rod. We're giving it away. It's the rod, reel, line, backing, everything you need to get out there on the water from a fly rod and reel standpoint. We're going to be giving that away. And the winner is going to be announced during episode, let me make sure I get the right one here for you folks. Episode 28 is when we're going to announce the winner. So you got like 2 weeks. Subscribe on either Apple or Spotify to the Untangled podcast, and then click the link in the podcast description. Submit your email address. That gets you entered to win the fly flinger and reel from all of us here at VFC. So I hope to see a whole bunch of entries into that. I'm really excited to give that away. I think it's going to be a ton of fun. And with that stuff all out of the way, we're going to jump right into the short questions to start the show off. First one comes to us today. Mike from Maryland writes in and says, there are lots of knots used in fishing. Well, what are the basic knots that a novice fly fisher must know, and what are they used for? Mike, really solid question. And I want to start this off by saying that I think we overcomplicate it. And by we, I mean all fly anglers. There's tons of debates about knots, which, I mean, who ever thought we would have been debating knots, right? You don't get into fly fishing and think that you're going to be in some argument on a forum or Facebook. Well, the Davy knot's actually better because just take yourself out of that for a minute. Yes, there's upsides and downsides to every knot. There's no reason to complicate it. The Davy knot's great. I personally use the clinch knot. The clinch knot's great. Do I have my knots fail me? Yes. Is it the knot or is it me or the tippet I was using? All of the above. Okay, no knot's perfect, but there's no reason to overthink this. You do want to use the right knot, but it's not nearly as daunting a task as I think a lot of us make it out to be. And every time I talk about knots, I need to bring this up. I always kind of flash back to my Boy Scout days. I was an Eagle Scout, so other Eagle Scouts out there, we'll do our secret handshakes later, right? But we had this scout leader. He was the biggest jerk I've ever met. This guy had an attitude problem, just about a mile wide. Just not a very good fella. Certainly should not have been a scout leader. So it's interesting that he was. Anyways, he was the fellow who would always test you on your knots for your merit badges or rank advancements. And if you didn't do it, if it wasn't like picture worthy, like we're going to shoot a picture and put this in a knot book. If it wasn't that good, man, he'd rip you a new one. So I was terrified of knots for a long time, and I just never wanted to deal with knots. And in fact, I lost a lot of fish early on because I was tying crappy knots because I was so sick of knots. It's like, it's good enough. It's fine. I'm not getting yelled at for this one. Right? So don't let any bad experiences with knots kind of ruin this for you either. I wouldn't want that to happen. But the knots that you need to know, there's three of them: the clinch knot, the surgeon's knot, the clinch, the surgeon's, and the perfection loop. There we go. I got them out there for you. The clinch knot is used to attach flies to leader and tippet or to set up multi-fly rigs. The surgeon's knot is used to join pieces of tippet together. And then the perfection loop is used to make a loop-to-loop connection between leaders and fly line. I've talked about how that's not my favorite connection, but it is a very useful connection. If you're out there and you can't do a nail knot, or it works in a pinch, it's a good one. So those are your three knots: clinch, surgeons, and perfection. That's what they're for. You want to make sure you master those. Keep it simple. Those three, I mean, we can get into blood knots, we can get into non-slip mono loops, and yeah, I use those, but you don't need them. Those are your three. Start with those, get them down, and then you can branch out a little bit. So good question, Mike. Thank you for sending that one in. And our next short little question, Wyatt from Texas writes in and says, how can I tell different size flies while in the water? Once I select a fly, I don't know which leader to use. Well, it's a little bit of a twofer question here, Wyatt. I appreciate it. It really is kind of tough to tell what size different flies are unless you get like really up close and look at them. So if you can, I would recommend like grab a handful off of the water, try and sort through them, pick some flies out of your box and hold them next to it. Try to get a gauge for size that way. Size-wise, I've found that for a vast majority, size 16 is a really good place to start if you're just unsure about what size to use. The 16 just feels like it kind of fits in a lot of situations. It's just a good do-it-all size for dries or nymphs. If you're just not quite sure what size exactly those fish are keyed in on. But this is a skill that you're going to develop as you go out fly fishing more and more. You're going to be able to just look at a bug and think, okay, yeah, that's about an 18. It just comes with experience. That's the best way I know to learn this skill, is just get out there and do it. Now, as far as knowing what leader to use, that's a lot simpler. I'm not going to tell you, oh, just get out and do it with your leaders, right? Kind of a rule of thumb to go by, a 4X leader is great for flies about 10 to 16. I really wouldn't go below 16 with 4X for dry flies anyway. It can cause a little bit of a drag there. If you fish below like a size 8, like 18 or smaller, you're definitely going to want 5X or finer leader there. Then if you're fishing above a size 10, rope up to like 3X, or you can go even heavier on that if you're fishing hoppers or streamers. Like I'll use just 8-pound fluorocarbon fly line, not even like tippet or leader or whatever. I just get the spool of it that they sell to they sell to conventional anglers. I use that stuff as well. It works out great. Also, I'll try to link this in the podcast description as well. We've got a whole tip of the week on this. It's tip of the week number 28 on Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube, where we cover all of this stuff. So I'll link that as well so you can get a visual representation of it. And that wraps up the intro of the show. So thanks, Wyatt and Mike, for those quick questions. And we're going to jump right on in to the meat of the show here. First question for us today on the show comes to us from David from Colorado. He writes in and says, how can you know what weight you should put on when nymphing? I have a hard time reading the water column. Along the same lines, how do I know if my indicator is too close or too far from the fly? I normally fish the South Platte or the Arkansas. David, your question makes me want to ask a question. Does anybody in Colorado fish dry flies anymore? Because it seems like I get a ton of nymphing questions from you Colorado anglers. And I know the tiny nymphs are all the rage out there, but dry flies work too. I just want to put that out there. Oh, kidding. I'm kidding. All right. I haven't poked at Colorado in like 2 weeks or something. It needed to happen. Okay. Well, the answer to your question here, David, is it depends. And I feel like I say that all the time, but it does. It depends on the depth of the river that you're fishing and if your flies are weighted or not. I do highly suggest using weighted flies. I tie all of my, well, not all, but like 99% of my nymphs, I tie with tungsten beads, and then I wrap a little bit of lead around the shanks of the hooks. I think it just helps them sink quicker, and it cuts down on how much split shot I end up having to use. I try not to use more split shot than is necessary. I don't like to use it very much, and I'll get into that at a later episode. This just wasn't the question to really dive into that, into my thought process on that, because my thought process is going to be a little convoluted at times. I'm sure that's going to surprise all you listeners out there. But I do go into more detail about the value of heavy flies versus using split shot in episode 5 of this podcast. So I've linked that in the show description as well, so you can get over to episode 5 really quick. Like I said, I'm sure we'll cover that topic in future episodes. And I don't really want to get too far away from David's question, which is why I'm referring you to episode 5 if you're interested in the heavy flies versus split shot debate. All right. Going back to David's question here. Using the right amount of weight is a skill that you're going to eventually get a feel for the more and more that you do it. And I think a lot of beginners overthink this situation. I know I did. I'd get out there and I'd be like, all right, I need 3.5 split shot, and they need to be exactly 18 3/4 inches above this fly. And I mean, yes, you can. And I know a lot of Euro nymphers do this. You really can just break things down to a science like that and just make it exact. And I know fly fishing attracts a lot of people who are like that, who have a very orderly way of doing things, an orderly way of looking at the world, but it doesn't have to be exact like that. So if that kind of stuff overwhelms you and you're like, that's too much work, don't worry. All right. Because there's no hard and fast, like this is going to work in every single situation rule that we can give you for how much weight to use or how much weight to not use or where to put your indicator. It all depends on what you're fishing. Right. Let me give you an example. And Really, before my example, though, I do want to say one thing. You need to worry less about how deep the river is and more about whether your flies are drifting in the right spot, right? Commit that to memory. The depth of the river doesn't matter, but where your flies are is what matters, right? Where are the fish going to be? Put your flies in front of them. That's the key with nymphing, with dry fly fishing, with this whole fly fishing game. Get your flies in front of fish. It's really simple. We overthink that way too often. Now, let me give you that example, what I mean by this. There's this run back on the lower Provo River because apparently that's the only place I fish. I was made aware that like all of my examples on the show are from the lower Provo. They're not, but the lower Provo is a great place to go fish, and I don't like to name drop either. So, but I spent a lot of time on the lower Provo. It was conveniently located. Like I could be to my favorite run on the lower in like 20 minutes from my favorite parking lot at school when I was going to college. So I kind of had that down to a science. I even built my class schedule in college around the best times for the hatches in the spring, specifically the blue wing hatch. It was pretty dependable, coming off most days at like 1. So I'd make sure I was out of class and up on the river by 1 as often as possible. And I graduated, believe it or not, with that sort of dedication. Anyways, I'm out there. I'm on the Provo River. There's this run that I used to fish all the time. And the fish really like to hang out like a ½ inch above the moss. That's just where I would consistently find them, no matter how deep the river was. If it was spring when the water was up really high, or if it was winter and the water was down to a trickle, they were consistently about a ½ inch above the moss. Just if I could get my flies just bouncing right above the moss, I knew I was getting my flies right where the fish wanted them. So yes, that meant sometimes I was putting a ton of split shot on and other times I was using hardly any. I was reacting to the situation out on the water. And that's the key. You've got to be willing and able to react and not go into it with such a fixed mindset of, well, it has to be this way. And if I don't rig up exactly the way that Durrant told me to on Untangled, then I'm not going to catch fish. No, that's not true. All right. You need to be able to adapt your rigs for any situation that you find yourself in. Now, of course, that's easier said than done. My rule of thumb on any river is that I want my bottom nymph in my rig, regardless if I'm fishing nymphs or a dry dropper, I want that to be just above the bottom of the river. Then your upper fly is probably like 18 to 24 inches above that. So you're covering a really wide section of the water column, and you're presenting those flies out to a much wider array of fish. You're giving yourself more opportunities, but more fish in the net. Another good rule of thumb here is use like 2 small to medium-sized split shot on your nymph rig to get those nymphs down to that depth. I've found that usually kind of does the trick, and then you can just pop them off if it's too much, or you can shorten your leader, you can move your indicator to compensate for that extra weight. Now, speaking of indicator, where do we put that? Well, I usually go just off the bat if I'm on a river that I've never fished before, or the water's at a different level than I think I've ever fished it at. I just try and set my indicator at like 1.5 times the estimated depth of the river. For example, if I'm fishing a run that looks like it's 3 feet deep, I want my indicator about 4.5 feet above my first fly. Now, like I've said, that's not a hard and fast rule, but it's a good place to start. If you start there, that's going to tell you pretty quick if your flies are deep enough. If they're deep enough, you'll be snagging bottom or catching salad on most casts. And if that's the case, you just move that indicator, just move it like an inch and just keep making those tiny adjustments until you're no longer snagging the bottom or grabbing salad with every cast. Then you know, boom, my flies are exactly where they should be. I'm in the strike zone, and you just keep making those adjustments until that fly is just barely above the bottom. That's the key to knowing, to sort of balancing your depth versus using your indicators, right? So hopefully that clears it up for you, David. I really appreciate the question. And as always, if you have any more, please don't hesitate to get in touch. Next question, Boyd from Utah writes in and says, How do you fish a steep falling river, very rocky, since you're from Utah? Since you're from Utah, the American Fork River. I'm always hanging up on rocks or my nymph is nowhere near the bottom of the river. Not to mention all the trees and bushes hanging over the water. Boyd, AF Creek's tons of fun, isn't it? Yeah, I spent a couple of years living in American Fork. My grandparents lived there, and I lived in my grandma's basement for many years, back when I had my Camaro, and I just fished all the time and didn't care about anything, didn't have a real job. It was, man, those were the days. Except I was always broke, and I ate a steady diet of Taco Bell. So that's what I have to thank for my beautiful, athletically overweight physique that I've got going on these days. Oh, shoot. Anyways, AF Creek's tons of fun, isn't it, Boyd? It's really kind of getting super crowded, though. Last time I fished up there, I couldn't believe it. But that really is kind of most of Utah these days. I mean, the joke always was that you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a church in Utah, but I think that kind of holds true for fly anglers as well. Like, you can't swing a dead cat without hitting a fly angler. So it's getting just packed over in Utah. But anyways, the type of water that you're talking about fishing is pocket water. And this is what I was teasing in the hook to this episode. And pocket water is, I mean, I don't want to say my favorite, but it's up there. If it's not my favorite, it's probably second favorite type of water to fish. Steep falling creeks that form pools and small pockets can be some of the toughest places to fish, but they are definitely among the most rewarding. A lot of anglers tend to skip over pocket water because it's tough to fish. And it is. It's tougher to fish, but I honestly prefer fishing the pocket water in a lot of cases, just because the fish in it tend to not see as many flies. They're very quick to hit your flies. It's just wonderful. It's fast, and I enjoy the quick aspect of fly fishing. It's one of the reasons that I love it so much. It's a very quick sport. You don't have to be super patient to be a fly angler. Especially not in pocket water on little mountain streams. Thank goodness. Now, we do have a really in-depth blog post about fishing pocket water. 100% recommend everybody go ahead, read that. I've linked it in the podcast description. It's going to go over everything that I'm saying here on the podcast in tons of detail, but it's going to have all these fancy diagrams that Alex put together for us. He's really good at that. You guys ever need diagrams, just ask Alex. I'm sure he'd be more than happy to do it for you. Oh, anyways, definitely check that one out. Now, I want to walk you through fishing pocket water. So let's go ahead and start with defining like what pocket water is, how to fish it, and then the rigs that I recommend for that type of fishing. So what is pocket water? Well, pockets are formed when water passes around a very large obstruction. Typically, these obstructions are rocks. That's what we think of as forming a pocket, but it can be anything, right? It can be a log, an old tire, your fishing buddy that just his waders filled up, and now he's forming a nice little pocket. No, I would hope that doesn't happen to anybody. Well, as water passes around that obstruction, I'm going to use a rock for the example through the rest of this. So I'm going to refer to rocks as creating our pockets, just because that's what usually does it. So as water passes around a rock, the regular current of the river gets interrupted, and that interruption forms these pockets of very calm water right behind the rock. Water in these pockets is moving obviously a lot slower, and that makes it an ideal place for trout to hang out because they can get out of the main rush of the current. They don't want to spend a ton of energy if they don't have to, right? Trout are really, they're like any other creature. Why spend tons of effort unless you absolutely have to, unless you're athletically overweight like myself? You kind of have to, right? All those daggum wings and Mountain Dew. And anyways, trout want to expend the least amount of energy for the most amount of food. So pocket water really becomes ideal habitat for them because they can just hang out there and let all the food come to them. They're not fighting the main push of the current. The current in these pockets is usually a lot less violent, so the fish conserve their energy a little bit. And all that turbulent water around them brings them a steady stream of food. Now, fishing this type of water is actually really easy once you know what to look for. Again, the diagrams in the blog post make this super helpful. But what you're looking for, so you see your pocket, right? You see your rock, there's water crashing all around it, and then right behind the rock is that calm water. The current's not hardly moving. That's the pocket. Now, fish aren't usually going to be sitting smack in the middle of that pocket. They are usually going to be either in front of the rock, okay, on the upstream side of it. They're either going to be on the sides or behind the pockets. They're going to be like on the edges of the pocket. All right. And if you're watching the video podcast, you get to see me make wonderful hand gestures here. I'm sure it's incredibly helpful, right? Now, if you look closely at some pocket water, what you're going to find is that the water in front of, on the sides, and behind the rock is slower than the water everywhere else. And since we know already, we've established this, that trout want to conserve energy, they're going to be holding in the water where that's moving slower, right? That makes sense. So you figured out where to cast. I prefer hitting the sides of the rock and then landing my flies just barely inside the pocket and letting the current kind of pull them into the current behind the rock. The fish really love to hang out there. So on either side of the rock, you're going to have a current coming off, and they kind of join and form two branches of a Y. And then you'll see a little bit of current where the two branches of the Y join that's moving slower than current on either side of it. That little spot right there is money. Okay, it's just right behind the pocket. Drop your flies in there or run them down the sides too. But usually it's just that little bit right behind the pocket. It's just money. That's my favorite spot. Now, Boyd's big question here was about making sure his nymph gets in the right spot. So how do you make sure that your flies are getting in the right spot when you're fishing pocket water like this? Well, I typically fish with a dry dropper rig and pocket water because it lets me cover as much of the water column as possible. And the key to being successful with this rig is to use a really heavy nymph and very minimal split shot, because it's okay if you end up dragging that nymph over the bottom a lot, because the trout will often take the nymph as it's dropping to the bottom. So they'll hit it before it even gets down to the bottom. They're really quick in pockets. That's, again, another reason why I love fishing pocket water. So the other reason that you can fish a really heavy nymph and it doesn't matter too much is the drift in the pocket is really short. So you really only need that fly to make that drift for a few seconds at most. Most pockets are pretty small. So if you hang up on every cast, just cut a few inches off of your dropper. I like fishing like a size 14 Frenchie or a Perdigon or North Fork Special. In a lot of pocket water, those fish sink quickly and the fish really love them. So those are the flies that I would recommend. Now, the last thing to note about pocket water here for you is you really do have to be adept at high sticking your flies through each likely hidey hole. Now, if you haven't heard before on the podcast, I know we've talked about it, but high sticking, really simple. It just refers to lifting as much of your fly line and leader off the water as possible. That gets rid of the drag on your dry fly or on your indicator, because that's something a lot of beginners overlook as well. If your indicator's got a ton of drag on it, what does that mean your nymphs are doing below the surface? It means your nymphs are zooming, okay, like they're Speedy Gonzalez down there, right? And that's not natural, okay? Nymphs do cruise, but they don't go flying off like they're on a rocket, okay? So watch for drag, whether it's on your dry fly or your indicator. That's going to tell you that your flies are getting that natural drift, which is what you want. And if there's drag at all, you got to mend it or high stick it, right? I prefer high sticking. Just make sure that as much line of leaders off the water as possible. That's going to get rid of that drag. Now, you are going to find that as you high stick, you're actually going to be casting a less line into each pocket. So you are going to end up hooking fewer trees as you go along, but you're going to hook trees in this business. All right, Boyd. So there's no getting around it. It's just a matter of look behind you, adjust your cast if need be, use a bow and arrow cast, use a steeple cast. Bow and arrow cast, it's where you hold the flies pull the line back, let go, and it shoots out like an arrow. And the whole time you're really nervous that the hook's going to slip and bury itself into your finger, which is another great case for barbless flies, because then you're not digging a barb out of your finger and teaching all the neighborhood kids new words. Not that I've ever done that before. The steeple cast, folks refer to this differently. That's what I learned it as. It's just where you cast directly above you instead of behind you. So if there's a lot of stuff behind you, you just cast directly above. So your cast is going straight above your head instead of behind your head. And that can kind of help mitigate hooking into a few things as well. But you are going to lose flies and hook up on trees in this business. That's just what you sign up for, right? Now, in case you think I'm full of it, right? Well, there's not really fish in this kind of water, Durrant. What are you talking about? Well, let me tell you a little story, all right? I was out with my best friend, Lander, and he and I were up on this little river. This is back when we lived in Utah. Lander lives in Alaska now, lucky son of a gun. And he was actually just out fishing this last weekend. Didn't even invite me. Can you believe that? I'm going up there later this summer, though, so we'll have some fun Alaska stories for you. But anyways, I'm out there with Lander and fishing the stream. We fished it a ton. It was close. It was convenient. It didn't get a whole ton of traffic then. It's probably mobbed now, but back then it didn't get a whole ton of traffic. And I was fishing pocket water. I was fishing through this pretty small pocket. I can't remember what I had on the top, but I know I had a size 18 zebra midge on the bottom. I know that because I was drifting my flies through the pocket, just like I explained. I actually put it on one of the side seams coming down, and right as it came down and kind of joined the bottom of that Y branch that I was talking about earlier, dry fly shoots under the water. I set the hook, and it felt big. All right, that was the thing that I took away from this was, oh, that's a fish. It's not the normal like 12-inch brown that we get in this river. It was something substantial. And sure enough, this fish shakes its head a few times, jumps. I swear, as it jumped, it turned and looked at me and kind of grinned. It was like, hey, it's on. And then he fell back in the water, shot off downstream, and I'm running after him, hollering, Lander, get the net, get it. And I'm trying not to slip and die, which I didn't avoid doing. I did slip. I fell in, and it wasn't too cold or nothing, but I'm sitting there just looking completely out of control, like I'm on the wrong end of a John Wick film. And eventually, with Lander's help, I get this fish in. And it is to date, still the biggest fish I've ever caught off of that creek. It was a 20-inch brown, came out of a tiny little pocket. And it took that nymph right as it was dropping, and it took that size 18 zebra midge. I've got some pictures. I might have to try and find them and show everybody. But that's one of the reasons I love pocket water so much, because those kinds of experiences are common, I want to say, in pocket water, where you do find fish that are a little bit bigger, because this water just gets overlooked, right? People aren't fishing it as much because it is tougher. It's tougher to read. It's tougher to land fish in it. You've got to be kind of quick with the net. If they start running down you on pocket water, you can lose a lot of fish. But once you figure it out, you're fishing the water that everybody else is skipping. So these fish are a lot more willing to take your flies. It's tons of fun. So I'd highly recommend getting out and giving it a shot. And hopefully that answers your question, Boyd. Thanks for sending that one in. And rounding out the show today, we got a question to us coming from Steve from Montana. Writes in and says, hello, Spencer. I've been enjoying the podcast episodes weekly. Love your little stories and answers to the questions. Well, thanks, Steve. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm looking at updating some of my equipment and wanted to hear your opinion on gear. First off, my boots seem a little tight. How much bigger should wading boots be than your regular shoe size? Can you recommend a good boot that fits over neoprene and is also good for hiking? Sometimes I like to hike a mile or so before I get in the water to fish. I've always used a fishing vest when on the water, but I'm intrigued by the newer chest packs, sling packs, etc. What are the pros and cons of those packs versus fishing vests when hiking and on the water fishing? Steve, really great questions and funny story actually about this. When I was living with my grandma at the time, so I was just out of high school, and I needed some wading boots, but I was too broke to pay for wading boots. So I had an old pair of Loa hiking boots, and I used those as my wading boots for like a year. They were the best thing to hike in. They were so comfortable, but they absolutely sucked for wading. They were not built to give you like a stable platform in the water, and they deteriorated really quickly because they're not supposed to be submerged for hours on end. So it is really important to make sure you've got a good pair of wading boots, because it's such a more comfortable experience. I think I talked about this 1 or 2 episodes ago too. It really is just a much more comfortable experience than using boots that aren't built for this. Now, for boots, most companies usually have it built into their sizing that you order the size of shoe that you normally wear, but the wading boots themselves are like a size larger than that. I know Corkers kind of has that built in already. I wear Corkers most often. So if I'm like a 12 in my street shoes, which I am, I buy a 12 from Corkers, and I'm golden. Now, I've also found that Orvis boots run about like a size small for me. So if I'm like a size 11 in Corkers, then I'm going to be a size 12 in Orvis. Now, both are great boots. I'm not knocking on Orvis. They're just a little bit smaller sometimes. So if the company that you are buying boots from doesn't specify that you should order true to your normal shoe size, then my rule of thumb would be just buy a size larger than that. Now, the best boot for hiking long distances that I've ever used is going to be the Corkers Terror Ridge boot. This thing has all the ankle support that you would want for a hiking boot. It's even got a heel lock, which is really cool, but it's a lot lighter than other wading boots too. And Corkers actually designed the Terror Ridge just for this purpose. They wanted a boot that would kind of be that dual purpose. It's a great wading boot, but you can also hike in as well. It's really excellent. It's my favorite if I know I'm going to be putting 5-6 miles on and I don't want to haul wading boots separately. I'll throw the Terror Ridge on, and they're great. Close runner up to that would be the Orvis Pro boots. Both of those boots are really good. I'd give a good long look to each one of those. Now, for the second part of your question about how do we haul our gear, I always wore a vest, mostly because that's what my dad used. And another funny story about that, I took my dad's vest. I was in high school, took his vest. I skipped class, went fishing. The fishing was great, by the way. But I got to the river, parked, and it was on. Access to this part of the river is questionable, right? I wasn't sure if it was actually public or not. But I parked, and you had to move a fence, one of those old barbed wire gates that's not really a gate, right? And I was walking through it, and the back of the vest caught on the barbed wire, and I ripped the vest just clean down the back. So I just kept fishing, right? The fishing was wonderful. Like I mentioned, I get home and my dad was like, well, why weren't you in school today? Well, I went fishing. Oh, by the way, you need a new vest. And he wasn't too pleased with that. He actually ended up buying me a brand new vest for my birthday that year, actually. He's a really good dad. So 10 out of 10, definitely do that for your kids. If they ruin something, just buy it for them for their birthday and then get yourself a new one, and hopefully they won't ruin that too. Now, I did get a chest pack for review I did a couple of years ago, and I actually ended up loving it so much that that's what I use now. I prefer my chest pack over my vest for 2 reasons. First off, it's a lot easier than on my neck and on my shoulders. They're not as sore. The vest is really convenient, but if you're anything like me, you probably stuff it full of way too much stuff that you'll never really use when you're out on the water, but it'll look cool. So you bought it and put it in your vest and forget that it's there. Well, that really just kind of starts to wear out your shoulders and neck, especially as the days get longer like they are right now. And the chest pack really just doesn't do that by virtue of how it hangs on your body. The weight's distributed a little bit differently. There's more support for that chest pack. And second, I really love the chest pack because it's smaller, so it's kind of forced me to condense my tackle and really only haul what I need just for a day on the water. If I need extra stuff, I'll throw it in the backpack, but that's pretty rare that I do that. There's rarely going to be a need for like 6 fly boxes while you're out there on the water. So it's nice to be forced to slim down and only carry what you need, but still have a convenient way to haul tackle to the water. That's really why I love the chest pack so sneaking much. Now, I can't really speak to the value of slings because I just don't wear them. I never found one that was as comfortable as my vest or as my chest pack. And I really don't like the idea of needing to swing them around whenever I need to grab gear from the big compartment. I know a ton of anglers love them, though. I know Berkeley likes his here at VFC. Alex has got himself, I think he's got himself a little hip pack now. I might be wrong on that. But all three of us, between us, none of us have the same pack. So it is very individualized. I can't really speak to slings too much just because I don't really use them a whole ton, but I know a lot of folks really enjoy them. So, well, that brings us to the end of the show, folks. Thank you for sticking around and listening. As always, I appreciate it, and I really appreciate all the questions that we've been getting. So please send them in. If you've got any other questions, I want to hear them. I want to answer them. There's always a link in the podcast description where you can submit your questions, get them answered here on the show. Also, don't forget the Fly Rod and Reel giveaway. We're going to announce the winner on episode 28 of the show. So you don't want to miss that. You have to subscribe to the podcast on either Apple or Spotify, and then use the link in the podcast description to submit your email address. Automatically enters you to win, and you might be fishing the rest of the summer in style with a brand new fly flinger and reel. Well, I know I'd want to do that if I were you folks. So, well, I hope this podcast episode was informative. Hope you laughed a little bit. If you cried, I hope they were tears of laughter and or joy. And if you cried for other reasons, let me know, because that means I'm doing something really wrong and I need to fix it. Kidding aside, really appreciate the time. Enjoy it as always. And until next week, folks, tight lines.